So good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. So I would like to invite and welcome all of you to this Ocean 20 dialogue on High Seas Treaty that's being convened by RISEP, the High Seas Alliance, and the Rio Project. I'm sorry, my pronunciation is bad, especially when I talk in other languages. So this is to help inform the G20 process and share a set of recommendations to the communique. My name is Shivaja. I'm a senior campaigner with RISEP. And just to give you a little bit of background about the webinar, this dialogue aims to emphasize the urgency and significance of the UN High Seas Treaty, which is the BBNJ Treaty, its ratification and swift entry into force. For this, we have brought together a panel of speakers, experts, I would say, from different countries who will outline the key elements of the treaty and its importance. And following the interventions from the speakers, we'll offer you an opportunity to engage with the speakers and ask questions and share your thoughts and comments. And I also want to highlight a set of shared policy recommendations to G20 countries on the BBNJ Treaty that are being drafted collaboratively with this Ocean 20 dialogue. The link for the same set of policy recommendations, which is in its draft stage, will be shared in the chat box. So please feel free to add your comments and thoughts into those Google forms so that we can compile all your comments and thoughts and come up with a final draft of recommendations that can be shared to the G20 process at a later stage. And before we get into the detailed webinar, let me also give you a bit of a housekeeping rules. So every speaker, every panelist will have 10 minutes to make their presentation, and please stick to the timeline so that we'll have some time for the question and answer session from the participants at the end. We have interpretation available in Portuguese, so please switch to the concerned channel for interpretation. Please speak slow for the smooth flow of interpretation. I guess probably I was taking it by a faster pace until now. I'll slow it down. And another very important point that I would like to share is that if you have any questions or comments or thoughts at any point of stage during the webinar, please feel free to type your questions and comments into the Q&A section. And the panelists will be attending and addressing your questions towards the end of the webinar. So with that, let's keep the conversation rolling. And let me introduce the first speaker to you. So to start with, we have Rebecca Hubbard, who is the Director of High Seas Alliance since February 2023 here. So she has spent the last 20 years working on environmental campaigns with NGOs from the local to international level. More recently, she headed up the Our Fish project in the European Union. She's Australian and lives in Tasmania. So Rebecca will be giving a quick overview of High Seas Alliance and its work on the treaty and towards its implementation. Over to you, Beck.
Thanks, Shivaja. It says my screen is loading. Can you see the presentation slides?
Yes, we can see your screen. Please go ahead.
Perfect. Thank you for having me, and hello, everybody. Thank you so much for joining this webinar. I will just launch straight into it because there's plenty of things to talk about. The High Seas Alliance is a global alliance of over 55 member groups, plus the IUCN, and we were established in 2011 to build a strong and united voice for the conservation of marine life in the high seas. We're incredibly fortunate to have international NGOs, but also many NGOs that are active in various countries and regions around the world, and some very impressive experts who have been involved in the conversation and development of the High Seas Treaty since the beginning, for around 20 years ago. So just to start, because it's not necessarily clear, the high seas is otherwise known as the area beyond national jurisdiction. and it's shown here in the map as the dark blue area. So the ocean covers around 70% of the planet, and 2/3 of that ocean is the high seas, or outside of national jurisdiction. So it's almost half of the planet, and by its sheer size and coverage is incredibly important. But why have we focused on the high seas? Obviously, the size matters in this particular case. But the high seas, as such an enormous part of the global ocean, is incredibly valuable on many different levels. It is teeming with life. It is filled with marine life that is essential to its functioning. Particularly, it regulates the climate, so it is the largest store of organic carbon on the planet. The ocean generally absorbs around 30% of our carbon dioxide emissions. It produces almost half of our oxygen. And I think it's important to note, and also absorbs over 90% of the excess heat that we create as a result of burning fossil fuels. And it's really important to emphasize this because it is essential to regulating our climate, but what is also essential to that is it being filled with marine life, it having what is known as a healthy and functioning biological pump. So all of the fish, mammals, birds, plankton, the life that is in the ocean and its movement ensures that the ocean can perform this incredibly important job in terms of climate regulation. It obviously also provides food for many, billions of people and supports livelihoods of millions, and is essential for reaching what's commonly known as 30 by 30, but is really the commitment by governments as part of the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework to protect 30% of our land and seas by 2030. And that's based on the science that is commonly understood and agreed that we need to protect 30% of these different ecosystems to ensure healthy and functioning ecosystems and the ongoing provision of these services that I've just mentioned. So being able to protect that 30% of the ocean is absolutely dependent on the High Seas Treaty. And the other thing really why we focus on the high seas is that they have been under an enormous amount of pressure for decades, increasingly from climate change, but also from illegal, unregulated, unreported, and overfishing. Also, obviously, we know about the impacts of pollution, excessive shipping and noise, and the impending threats of deep sea mining and marine geoengineering, which is the unproven and risky technology of trying to get the ocean to absorb more carbon dioxide emissions than it already does. And I guess underlying all of that and compounding all of those pressures is the fact that there has been a very poor governance system. So we have the International Convention on the Law of the Sea, but there are a number of really critical gaps. And that is why the High Seas Treaty is so important. So last year, in fact, in my first week of work with the High Seas Alliance, and thanks to the decades of work from other people, including many governments, the treaty was agreed. So the text was agreed, and it was really heralded as a great gain for multilateralism, but also in the sense that it gave hope that many governments could work together to deliver this thing of great benefit for the whole planet. And also just to really, I guess, recognize that it was really bringing ocean governance into a new era. And it just wanted to show this journey because it's really significant in the sense that, you know, it took over 20 years, if you follow this path from the beginning of the discussions to get to the treaty agreement. But actually, we're kind of at the beginning. We still have so much to do in terms of getting this treaty ratified and getting it entered into force so that we can really start to protect marine life, protect what's in the ocean, and better manage and minimize the harm that is happening in the high seas. And I guess why the treaty is so significant and the governance gaps that it really does plug, and you'll hear a lot more detail about these, but just as an overview, there are 4 main pillars to the treaty. One, as I mentioned, is the fact that it creates the legal framework or provides a legal framework for creating and establishing high seas marine protected areas. It's got very clear rules and a procedure for doing that. And as I said, that's incredibly critical to being able to protect at least 30% of the global ocean by 2030. So that's one of its most significant features. There isn't another international law that can do this, not for the whole high seas. It also has an important feature on requiring the environmental impact assessments for potentially harmful activities in the high seas, and someone will give a detailed description about the rules and requirements around environmental impact assessments. But this is really important in terms of a transparent process for assessing potentially harmful activities, a process that really acknowledges the precautionary principle and that acknowledges the potential compounding impacts of many activities in the high seas. And then the other 2 pillars that are really important in addressing ocean equity and justice are the capacity building and transfer of marine technology chapter, which really looks to support countries to be able to implement the High Seas Treaty and provide capacity and information that can better support all countries in the mission to protect the biodiversity and ensure sustainable management in the high seas. And the final pillar is around providing fair and equitable rules on accessing and sharing benefits from marine genetic resources. I know that we have speakers that go into each of these elements, so I'm not going to talk about those in more detail, but just to say that right now, the treaty has been opened for signing. Well, it was adopted almost 1 year ago. It opened for signing in September. 90 countries have signed the treaty thus far, and 5 countries have ratified. We need at least 60 countries to ratify the treaty before it enters into force. We also really need these strong treaty institutions to be established, which are mentioned in the treaty text, but are not they're not already detailed and designed. So we really need these institutions to be set up so that they're transparent and effective and representative as well. And then the third and final step will be implementation. So delivering the treaty and putting it into place so that we can better protect the ocean and its marine
Beck,
life.
sorry to interrupt, but Beck, could you please conclude?
Yeah, this is it. So basically, as I said, 90 countries have ratified, 90 have signed, 5 have ratified. The High Seas Alliance has this ratification tracker and online, which people can follow progress on. And yeah, I will leave it. That's it. I'll pass it over.
Thank you so much, Beck. Thank you for this comprehensive overview on ABNJ and the BBNJ treaty. It clearly shows that we have a lot of work to do, a lot more work to do in the coming months and years. So with that, let's dive deeper into the key elements of the treaty. For that, we have Nicola Clark, who will be sharing her thoughts through a pre-recorded video. Unfortunately, she couldn't make it to the webinar. So Nicola Clark is a senior officer working on ocean governance issues at the Pew Charitable Trust. She also leads the High Seas Alliance's Area-Based Management Tools Working Group and co-leads the IUCN World Commission on Protected Areas High Seas Specialist Group. Previously, Nicola worked on international fisheries issues at the NOAA. Nicola is from the US and is based in the Washington, D.C. So she'll be giving us an overview of the area-based management tools provisions of the treaty. So Elena, could you please start playing the video?
Good morning, everyone. My name is Nicola Clark. I work for the Pew Charitable Trusts, and I have been following high seas issues for a really long time. So it's a pleasure to join you all today to talk a little bit more about the High Seas Treaty, and then specifically to dive in on some of the aspects related to marine protected areas under this new agreement. So to begin with, let's start with a reminder of why it is that we needed this High Seas Treaty in the first place. So the core problem is that our current system of governance, it's this wonderfully complex myriad of regional and sectoral governance mechanisms that manage different aspects of human activities in different parts of the world, with varying degrees of success. And throughout all of this messy governance overlapping gaps, they also don't do a great job of coordinating and communicating with each other, these different governance bodies. And through these governance gaps, there have been a few really crucial pieces that have slipped through the cracks. And namely, until this agreement, we didn't have any mechanism to be able to establish high seas marine protected areas for the entirety of the high seas. And there really weren't very strong obligations to conduct robust environmental impact assessments. So in short, conservation slipped through the gaps of this current system of governance. Now, these governance gaps were magnified by the scale of the problem. That's because 2/3 of the ocean, or almost half of the planet, is considered the high seas. So all of those areas in dark blue on the screen are high seas areas. And then finally, I'm not sure how many of you have heard about the Montreal Convention on Biological Diversity target to protect 30% of the oceans by 2030. But of course, just mathematically, if the high seas are 2/3 of the ocean and we want to try and protect 30% of the ocean, it's going to be really difficult to meet that 30 by 30 goal without the high seas. And at the moment, only about 1% of high seas areas are protected. And so I mentioned today, I'm going to be focusing on the area-based management tool chapter of the agreement. So there were 4 chapters plus cross-cutting issues, and you're going to hear from some incredible speakers on all of the other different chapters of the agreement, but I will be diving in on the marine protected area chapter. So what did we actually get in this final treaty text? I mentioned before that there was this governance gap beforehand that made it really difficult to establish protected areas in the high seas. It's a really important gap that this new agreement fills. So the new treaty empowers this new high seas governance body to create high seas marine protected areas, and associated management measures. And it actually sets an objective of this new agreement is to create a connected network of marine protected areas. And as I mentioned, this is going to be really critical for reaching our 30 by 30 goals. Secondly, another important thing it does is it allows marine protected areas to be established by a vote when consensus cannot be reached. There are a couple of other high seas areas where they've had this challenge of wanting to create marine protected areas, but 1 to 2 countries have been able to block that establishment because in those bodies, consensus is required. A third really important aspect of this new agreement, it sets an objective of the area of the Marine Protected Area chapter of building capacity and transferring marine technology to support developing countries in developing, monitoring, and managing marine protected areas, which I think is a really important piece to have to advance some of the overarching goals of this agreement. And then a final exciting piece that's included in this Marine Protected Area chapter of the agreement is what we refer to as emergency measures. So the new agreement allows the new high seas body to adopt measures that would respond to natural or human-caused emergencies. Now, it's not all roses. There are a couple of challenges that we find in this new agreement. So first of all, I mentioned that there's this new power to establish marine protected areas and associated measures. That power is also balanced with an obligation for this new BBNJ or high seas body to respect the competences of existing bodies. And really the challenge of that is actually unclear what that will mean in practice. It's subject to a couple of different interpretations. And really we're just gonna have to see what the future BBNJ Conference of Parties does at the end of the day. Second, I mentioned that protected areas can be established by a vote. They can, but that vote came with a cost, and that was the inclusion of what's known as an objection procedure. So future BBNJ parties can opt out of measures. That being said, there are a number of important constraints to this objection procedure. So a BBNJ party can only object under certain conditions. There are 3 reasons that a party may object. You can't object because you don't feel like it. You can't not adopt something because it's inconvenient for you. There are only 3 reasons that you're allowed to object to a particular measure. The second sort of constraint to this opt-out is that even if you do object or opt out from a BBNJ measure, you have an obligation, number 1, to not undermine the measure that you are opting out of. And number 2, to try and establish measures for your own party that would be similar in effect to the measure that you're opting out of. And then the third constraint of this opt-out is that you have to renew it every 3 years. And if a country that's objected fails to renew its objection after 3 years, then actually that measure would then become binding on that party. The third sort of challenge or limitation with this new chapter is I mentioned that BBNJ can adopt measures to respond to natural or human-caused emergencies, but there's a recognition that they will have to first figure out exactly how they're going to do that. They need to set up a special process that they would use in order to set up and use these emergency measures. So that's one thing they have to do. The other thing that they have to do is it has to be shown that there's no other management body or organization that can address this threat in a timely manner. And if there's no other body that can do it, then BBNJ can step in to act. And I thought I would talk a little bit more about the process for creating a high seas marine protected area under the treaty. And in broad strokes, a state or a group of states that's a member to the treaty would submit a marine protected area proposal. That the treaty spells out, that proposal must include certain information, including, of course, the identification of the area to be protected, the threats that face that area, and a draft management plan with draft management measures. The sort of second step would be a formal consultation process on the proposal. There are a number of stakeholders that have to be consulted with. That's spelled out in the treaty, and that includes Indigenous people and local communities, civil society, and then other management bodies such as regional fisheries management organizations. The third step is the consideration of all of that input received during the stakeholder consultation. And then if necessary, the state or group of states that submitted the proposal would have the option to revise if they wanted to revise to respond to any of the input received during the stakeholder consultation process. After all of that's happened, the MPA proposal would be submitted for review by the scientific body, which would then assess the proposal and provide recommendations to the decision-making body. And then the final step would be that the decision-making body would decide whether or not to establish that MPA based on everything above, the stakeholder consultation and the scientific review in particular. Now, I think we know that it'll be at least a couple of years before this new BBNJ agreement is up and running and we'll be able to actually submit High Seas MPA proposals. So what can we do now to prepare for future BBNJ MPAs? Now, I should say there's a lot of work that can and needs to be done in order just to get the whole agreement entered into force swiftly, and that's doing some getting the number of ratifications we need, institution building, but I'll let some of my colleagues speak to that later. When we look to the Marine Protected Area chapter specifically, some of the work that could begin now in order to start building these future BBNJ MPA proposals include stakeholder engagement. It would be really good to understand which high seas areas are important to which stakeholder groups, and then to further understand what it is precisely that they want to protect within these areas. Secondly, is building the scientific case. There's some data and information out there, but we always need more. So I think part of building that case is collecting and analyzing the existing data, but also supporting scientific research to fill data gaps that exist. And then a final thing that we can start doing now to help prepare is to think about implementation of these marine protected areas. So more specifically, thinking about how these MPAs will be monitored, enforced, reviewed, and financed so that we can start working on identifying partners and tools that we can use in order to ensure that we are successfully implementing these future BBNJ MPAs. And with that, I'll just leave my contact information up in case anybody wants to reach out for more questions, but otherwise I will hope to join you for the Q&A later. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Nicola. Thank you for bringing in the perspective of significance of High Seas Treaty on area-based management, and also for touching on challenges, limitations, and the ways forward. As the next speaker, we have Dr. Khalil Hassan Ali, who is a senior researcher at the Institute of Marine Affairs in Trinidad and Tobago, with over 10 years of experience in the field of marine policy and governance. He served as lead negotiator for the Caribbean Community on environmental impact assessment during the BBNJ agreement negotiations. Khalil is also currently a member of the Legal and Technical Commission of the International Seabed Authority. Khalil will be talking on the ways in which the treaty will help prevent harmful activities through its provision on environmental impact assessments. Dr. Khalil, over to you.
Thank you, Sylvia, and hello everyone. I hope you're all doing well. It's really a pleasure to join you in this space discussing the BBNJ agreement. And let me first thank the organizers for inviting me to be part of this event. In this brief talk today, I'll give some insights into the EIA negotiations, the Environmental Impact Assessment negotiation, and perspectives on the outcomes of the EIA part of the BBNJ agreement, mainly from a Caribbean community or CARICOM perspective. This hopefully will give some insight into how the treaty will help prevent harmful activities and mitigate the impact of activities proposed in ABNJ or areas beyond national jurisdiction. As we all know, Part 4 of the BBNJ agreement deals with environmental impact assessment. CARICOM was an active participant in the negotiations on this part throughout the entire Intergovernmental Conference where we've joined forces with a few other delegations to create a formidable negotiating bloc. Our overall collective vision was to attain greater equity in management of the global commons, including by attaining pluralization of voices in decision-making as it relates to activities proposed to take place in areas beyond national jurisdiction. Looking back, I think one of the most crucial developments to occur in negotiation of the EIA path was the uniting of two regional groups, CARICOM, or the Caribbean Community, and the Pacific Small Island Development States, or PSIDS. While we were working together informally in the early stages of the IGC, in the 4th and 5th IGC sessions, submission of a joint proposal on the EIA path was a game changer, in my opinion. This joint proposal, among other things, reflected high ambition and advanced thinking on internationalization of the EIA process. We also sought to reinforce recognition of our groups as thought leaders and important negotiating partners on the path. Of course, during the intersessional period between the IGC5 and the resumed IGC5, CARICOM and PSIDS further bolstered support for key elements of its EIA proposal, forming a wider coalition with essential partners, which included the African group, Costa Rica, Chile, and the Philippines. And really the main intention of this like-minded group was to push for and attain an appropriate level of global oversight in the EIA process for proposed activities that occur in or have impacts in areas beyond national jurisdiction. I think the EIA part really crystallized after many, many long hours of intense discussions, mainly between our like-minded group and another coalition that formed, calling themselves the Whale Sharks, which consisted of the European Union, Australia, Canada, the US, the UK, New Zealand, Norway, and Singapore. Now, it must be said that the final outcome of the EIA part reflected lower ambition that I think CARICOM would have hoped for. But that said, we were able to lobby for the inclusion of significant and important elements in the text that would go some way in safeguarding the express interests, including adequately protected the marine environment of areas beyond national jurisdiction, ensuring that activities permitted to occur in areas beyond national jurisdiction minimize negative impacts on areas falling under the jurisdiction of our countries, and indirectly and directly filling existing capacity gaps to conduct and assess the highly technical EIAs under the BBNJ regime. Now, with that little background, I'll now go into some thoughts on more specific points. To build on what is contained in UNCLOS, the BBNJ agreement does manage to achieve a tiering of the EIA process. Although the threshold for determining whether an EIA should be conducted remains the UNCLOS 206 standard of the potential to cause substantial pollution or significant and harmful changes to the marine environment, there's now a clear process and more robust criteria outlined to aid in making that determination. Any proposed activity that may have more than a minor or transitory effect on the marine environment, or if the effects are unknown or poorly understood, these activities will have to be screened. And this screening, with its specific requirements, should enable determination of whether there are reasonable grounds for believing that the proposed activity will exceed the UNCLOS 206 threshold for conduct of an EIA. I think the BBNJ agreement also has strong provisions on transparency, and particularly as it relates to all reports, including decision-making documents arising out of the EIA process. The clearinghouse mechanism, which I think someone will speak a bit about later, will serve as a repository for all reports and documents. In addition, the agreement is very progressive as it relates to public notification, participation, and consultation throughout the EIA process. CARICOM are pleased with the outcomes in these respects, including the fact there are special requirements for targeted and proactive notification and consultation when involving SIDS, or Small Island Developing States, and also with regard to surrounding states when involving proposed activities that affect high seas pockets. The high seas pockets language, along with adjacency language in the EIA part, were huge wins, especially for PSIDS, who were fervent champions of these elements of the EIA part. One disappointment for CARICOM was that the BBNJ agreement does not include provisions that enable COP decision-making on the potentially most impactful activities. This was advanced by CARICOM with the reasoning that ABNJ represents the global commons, and therefore it was felt that this justified collective decisions on whether the potentially most impactful activities proceed or not. COP decision-making was a red line for many states in the negotiations, particularly the developed ones, and therefore this ambition really proved unattainable. However, there are important elements of Part 4 that do allow for global oversights and checks and balances on state decisions under the BBNJ agreement relating to the EIA process. These include, firstly, scientific and technical body consideration and evaluation of draft EIA reports. This STB role, I would say, is important for a number of reasons, but in particular for states with limited capacity to review what will undoubtedly be highly technical documents. An impartial global body with the requisite experience and expertise performing this role of review really provides a sense of comfort. The second important check on state decisions in the EIA part is a call-in mechanism open to all states parties, but which also involves the STB, scientific and technical body, for negative screening decisions. That is a decision taken by a state that no EIA is required for a proposed activity. And the third check, again, involves a call-in mechanism. And this particular call-in is to be used for any negative, unforeseen circumstances and or observed breaches in the conditions under which an activity was given permission to proceed after the activity has commenced. In all the call-in mechanisms, concerns can be raised to the party under whose jurisdiction or control the activity falls, and these concerns may be addressed. I think moving on, the existence of a decision-making standard for permitting activity is another positive development that has come about through the treaty. It was really a significant achievement to get inclusion of text that would see the operationalization of a standard whereby a decision to authorize the planned activity under the jurisdiction or control of a party shall only be made when, taking into account mitigation or management measures, the party has determined that it has made all reasonable efforts to ensure that the activity can be conducted in a manner consistent with the prevention of significant adverse impacts on the marine environment. This decision-making standard and this text is another tool to really rein in unbridled liberties of states to the agreement. Another point I'd like to highlight in this talk is that CARICOM was seeking language in the BBNJ agreement to develop and enhance a practical and effective liability and compensation mechanism for activities taking place in areas beyond national jurisdiction, especially in the face of wholly state-driven decision-making process. However, language to directly enable this was not attained in the final treaty text. Direct reference to the idea of having a liability and compensation fund be developed and established under the COP, under the agreement's funding mechanism, was also not achieved. In the preamble of the agreement, however, states are indeed reminded that they may be held liable for damage to the marine environment under international law. And additionally, under the general principles and approaches in Article 7, the polluter pays principle is listed. These are both useful inclusions in the agreement, and there's nothing precluding the BBNJ COP from developing a liability and compensation mechanism tailor-made to really suit the future BBNJ regime. Therefore, this ideal can continue to be pursued by states individually and collectively when they become party to the BBNJ agreement. I'd also like to note that the agreement makes provisions for states with capacity constraints in conducting and evaluating screenings and EIAs to request advice and assistance from assigned experts with regard to increasing the capacity of states to engage in the BBNJ's EIA process. The EIA part also includes an objective on building and strengthening the capacity to prepare and evaluate EIAs and strategic environmental assessment. This will be operationalized through Part 5 of the agreement, which I think someone will talk about a bit later. And of course, any capacity building resulting from becoming party to the BBNJ agreement will also be applicable in both areas within and beyond national jurisdiction.
Dr.
I think
Khalil,
that,
can we please conclude? I'm sorry
yeah,
to
yeah,
interrupt.
I'm wrapping up now. The last point I would like to make is that the inclusion of strategic environmental assessment in the BBNJ agreement was another progressive development. In particular, CARICOM are very pleased with the ability given to the COP to conduct regional assessments that would synthesize available information about an area, assess current and potential future impacts, and identify data gaps in research priorities. Such types of SEAs have the potential to really revolutionize the way that the ocean is managed by encouraging a more proactive, inclusive, and integrated approach. It really also facilitates a management approach that could allow for more complete evaluation and mitigation of cumulative impacts, including those from climate change. So I'll close my remarks here. I do hope that they have proven interesting and will be helpful in further deliberations and conversations. Thanks again for having me, and I do look forward to further discussions. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Khalil. Thank you for detailing on the technicalities of one of the most important aspects of the High Seas Treaty, which is environmental impact assessment. And it is also quite insightful to understand your contributions to the finalization of the text. Thank you so much. As our next speaker, we have Ms. Amber Maggio, and she'll be sharing her thoughts on capacity building and technology transfer aspects of the treaty. Amber is a legal officer at the Division of Ocean Affairs and the Law of the Sea of the United Nations Office of Legal Affairs. Her work covers various aspects of the law of the sea, but primarily focuses on the new BBNJ agreement and capacity building. She previously worked in academia and the NGO sector before joining the United Nations, always with a focus on oceans and the law of the sea. Amber, over to you, Amber.
Thank you very much. Let me just share my screen. I hope that's working. So thank you very much. I would like to begin by thanking the organisers for the invitation. Dwells is always pleased to be able to share some of our thoughts and wisdom on the treaty, although of course with no real interpretation. So today I'm going to focus on providing you with an overview of the capacity building and transfer of marine technology provisions of the agreement, or CBTMT. So the BBNJ agreement, as the third implementing agreement to UNCLOS, must be interpreted and applied in the context of and in a manner consistent with UNCLOS. Part 14 of UNCLOS covers the development and transfer of marine technology. However, it was noted by delegations during negotiations of the BBNJ agreement that this part of the convention has not been effectively implemented to date. CBTMT is one of the key issues under the agreements and was negotiated as part of the package of issues. Part 5 of the agreement is dedicated to CBTMT, but there are relevant provisions throughout the agreement. The agreement also contains 14 general principles and approaches, several of which are relevant to CBTMT, such as the principle of equity, the full recognition of the special circumstances of small island developing states and of least developed countries, and the acknowledgement of the special interests and needs of landlocked developing countries. The objectives of the BBNJ agreement can most effectively be achieved if all states are able to implement its provisions and participate in the activities undertaken under it. The provisions of the agreement on CBTMT make important strides towards strengthening the capacity of states to that end. So what are the objectives of the agreement in relation to CBTMT? They include to assist parties in implementing the agreement to achieve its objectives, to enable inclusive, equitable, and effective cooperation and participation in the activities undertaken under the agreement, develop the marine scientific and technological capacity, including with respect to research of parties and with regard to conservation and sustainable use of BBNJ. Increase, disseminate, and share knowledge on the conservation and sustainable use of BBNJ. and support developing states parties in achieving the objectives of the agreement relating to marine genetic resources, including the fair and equitable sharing of benefits, measures such as area-based management tools, including marine protected areas, and environmental impact assessments. In giving effect to Part 5, parties are required to give full recognition to the special requirements of developing states parties to the agreement, in particular, least developed countries, landlocked developing countries, geographically disadvantaged states, small island developing states, coastal African states, archipelagic states, and developing middle-income countries. But what is CBTMT under the agreement more precisely? The agreement does not define capacity building or transfer of marine technology. However, it generally includes, but is not limited to, support for the creation or enhancement of the human, financial management, scientific, technological, organizational, institutional, and other resource capabilities of parties. It also provides a non-exhaustive list of types of CBTMT. The agreement does provide a definition of marine technology as including inter alia, sampling and methodology equipment, observation facilities and equipment, computer and computer software, including models and modeling techniques, related biotechnology, and expertise, knowledge, skills, technical, scientific, and legal know-how, and analytical methods related to the conservation and sustainable use of marine biological diversity. So CBTMT is promoted under the agreement in several ways. First, through enhanced cooperation. Parties must cooperate at all levels and in all forms to assist parties, in particular developing states parties, in achieving the objectives of the agreement through CBTMT. They must also cooperate to achieve transfer of marine technology, particularly to developing states parties that need and request it. Second, through modalities for capacity building. So parties within their capabilities are required to ensure capacity building for developing states parties. Within their capabilities, they are required to provide resources to support CBTMT and to facilitate access to other sources of support. Third, through modalities for TMT. So transfer of marine technology under the agreement must take place on fair and most favorable terms, including on concessional and preferential terms, and in accordance with mutually agreed terms and conditions, as well as the objectives of the agreement. TMT must take into account all rights over such technologies and have due regard for all legitimate interests. Importantly, the marine technology transferred must be appropriate, relevant, and, to the extent possible, reliable, affordable, up-to-date, environmentally sound, and available in an accessible form. And fourth, through institutional support. A CBTMT committee is established under the agreement to, among other things, carry out monitoring and review of CBTMT. The clearinghouse mechanism established under the agreement will perform functions relating to CBTMT. The financial mechanism established under the agreement will provide funding for CBTMT. The agreement provides that CBTMT should be country-driven, transparent, effective and iterative process that is participatory, cross-cutting, and gender responsive. There are three major steps in the process for obtaining and providing CBTMT under the agreement. CBTMT is to be based on and responsive to the needs and priorities of developing states parties. In order to identify such needs and priorities, the agreement envisages needs assessment, for which funding will be mobilized. Developing states parties that need CBTMT can request it. Parties to the agreement are to cooperate in providing CBTMT in all levels and in all forms. Parties are to provide resources within their capabilities for CBTMT. The financial mechanism established under the agreement will also provide funding, as I mentioned. And as I mentioned, the agreement sets out a mechanism for monitoring and review of CBTMT. So the committee will Assess and review the needs and priorities of developing states parties. Review support required, provided, and mobilized, and gaps in meeting assessed needs, and make recommendations for follow-up activities. Parties are to submit reports to support the monitoring and review of CBTMT. So if you will allow me to conclude by providing some information on ongoing capacity building in relation to the agreement, not quite under the agreement yet, but certainly in preparation. In response to a request of the General Assembly in Resolution 77321, Dwalos, which provides the interim secretariat in relation to the agreement, is currently implementing a program of activities to promote a better understanding of the agreement and prepare for its entry into force. These activities include capacity needs and priority assessments in relation to the agreement, regional workshops, national technical assistance, including needs assessment and bilateral assistance, briefings, side events, and the development of capacity building tools and outreach materials. We are also currently working on an interim website for the agreement. In addition to the activities supported through the United Nations regular budget, Dwalos is also receiving support from the European Union to implement a number of activities over the next 2 years. This will also include further capacity needs and priority assessments for states, further regional workshops, and the publication of case studies. Further information about this is available on our website, which we have, until the interim website is set up, we have a kind of unclear situation on the website, so there's a variety of web addresses there, but I'm sure you will find the information if you look for it. I'm happy to answer any questions when we come to it, and thank you once again for allowing us the time to share this intervention, and thanks to the organisers.
Thank you, Amber. Thank you very much for shedding the light on the aspects on capacity building and TMT within the purview of equity and inclusivity. We'll have more discussions on equity in the coming from the coming panelists as well. I also have seen a couple of questions in the Q&A section. We'll be taking the questions after 2 more panelists. So please add in more questions if you have any further questions or comments. So let me invite the next speaker, Daniel Kahoris. So Daniel is cross-cutting coordinator for High Seas Alliance and is currently focusing on supporting the development of a strong institutional framework for the High Seas Treaty. He's an expert on oceans, fisheries, wildlife law and policy, and previously was the executive director of Sea Shepherd Legal and Marine Species Office at the CITES Secretariat. Daniel is from Germany, but currently living in Austria. So Daniel will be giving an overview on the equity, finance provisions, as well as the building blocks for the effective functioning of the treaty. Over to you, Daniel.
Thank you, Sivaya, and always great to follow Amber, who already covered parts of the sort of overall equitable package of the agreement. Sorry, I have. So you have heard about all of the great benefits, conservation benefits that the BBNJ agreement provides, and the reasons why it was necessary, the threats on the ocean. So some of you will be surprised to hear that the treaty was actually stuck on the marine genetic resources part, both during the first part of the 5th session and the second part of the 5th session as well. So I want to kind of explore that a little bit. As Nicola mentioned, and I think some other speakers have mentioned as well, the reason why that's possible is because there were several gaps identified in the law of the sea that were the reason why states decided to negotiate the BBNJ agreement. But different states had different interests, and it was only once they had agreed on a package in 2011 that they actually came to the decision to launch the negotiations. And that 2011 package includes marine genetic resources and the sharing of benefits, area-based management tools, including MPAs, environmental impact assessments, and capacity building and the transfer of marine technology. On top of that, delegations also decided that they want to advance the negotiations of these different parts of the agreement in lockstep. So they didn't want to make a lot of progress in one part of the agreement while not making progress in other parts of the agreement. And that allowed, for example, disagreement in the MGR part to stop the negotiations as a whole until that was resolved. So tackling both the finding a compromise on the MGR part of the agreement and the principles that relate to that part of the agreement was absolutely crucial in getting the treaty over the line. So what are actually marine genetic resources? What are MGRs? The ocean has a high level of biodiversity. It's largely unstudied, but expected to hold great economic and scientific opportunity. And especially it has a lot of structural biodiversity. It has the largest structural biodiversity. And structure and function tend to be coded in genes. So there's an expectation that that will have applicable uses, for example, pharmaceuticals or new types of materials. The treaty defines marine genetic resources as any material of marine plant, animal, microbial, or other origin containing functional units of heredity of actual or potential value. And it also covers what you could call the digital cousin or the digital shadow of that information, digital sequence information. Digital sequence information isn't defined in the treaty, but very broadly, it means digitalized information on a marine genetic resource. But obviously the capacity and the technology to access and use those marine genetic resources and digital sequence information are unequally distributed. And one of the reasons why states started to decide to negotiate the BBNJ agreement was to resolve these inequities. So what did we get in the MGR part? There were two main principles from UNCLOS that were very relevant in the discussions that states fought about. One is the freedom of the high seas, so the first come, first serve. And the other one is the common heritage of humankind that applies to the resources of the seabed. And what we got was a compromise to balance the freedom of marine scientific research, especially among the freedoms of the high seas, with the fair and equitable sharing of benefits. And so what the part does is it establishes a notification system with a pre-cruise notification, a post-cruise notification, and a utilization notification, meaning that if a state that has jurisdiction over a research cruise, they need to notify in advance before the cruise leaves and give certain information. And then again, when the cruise comes back, and again, when MGRs or digital sequence information from that cruise are being utilized. So for example, turned into a commercial product and commercialized. It also includes obligations to share non-monetary benefits. And some of that is directly related to the notification system. The notification system assures that other states know where a particular sample is kept, what the modalities would be to access it, where digital sequence information is uploaded in public databases. But then there are also things like allowing for researchers from developing countries to participate in research cruises. Research cruises are very expensive, so that provides sort of an additional way to participate. And then there's an obligation to share monetary benefits. The way that this is the way that states found a compromise in the agreement is that initially the monetary benefits will not be tied to the actual value of commercialized marine genetic resources, but it will be a decoupled payment system. So countries will, developed countries will pay a fixed amount per year to the special fund that Amber already mentioned, as one of the sources for funding for capacity building and transfer of marine technology. Initially, developing countries wanted to have the monetary benefits tied to the actual value of commercialization. And there were a lot of discussions about what type of traceability system or monitoring system would need to be in place in order to ensure that that can be measured. But in the end, there was an agreement that the decoupled payment system, at least for the beginning, would provide a predictable funding stream from the get-go. And the COP can later decide on additional modalities if it wishes to do so. Or it will decide on additional modalities. There's also the setup of a monitoring framework to make sure that these provisions are being implemented, and a dedicated committee that has ownership and that can provide guidance on the implementation of these provisions. This has been celebrated as a win for equity by many key delegations. For example, Ambassador Michael Kanu, who was the lead negotiator for the African group, or the chair of the Group of 77. Then just briefly mentioning the overall financing system of the agreement. As other international agreements, the institutions, so the Secretariat, the COP, and the running of the agreement will be funded through what is called assessed contributions. So that's an annual contribution that each state makes according to a scale that is agreed by the governing body, in this case, the COP. There's also a voluntary trust fund to facilitate participation by delegations from developing countries in meetings of BBNJ. And then there is the capacity building and implementation assistance funding, and that is to come either from the special fund or from the Global Environment Facility. They both have sort of the same mandate. And the special fund is also open to additional contributions from parties and private entities. There will be a finance committee to review and recommend improvements to resource mobilization and guidance on the running of the financial mechanism. But that finance committee, for example, is still to be established, and a lot of elements are still to be determined or operationalized. And we just published a briefing on the finance mechanism yesterday. I'll post it in the chat. Because across the treaty, as was mentioned by many of my colleagues, there are many sort of details, modalities, terms of reference undetermined, and that would take a lot of time to resolve at COP1. We have, and many states have from the beginning, argued that a preparatory commission is needed to prepare for COP1 and for the operationalization of the agreement. The General Assembly has now decided on holding such a meeting, and the first 3-day organizational meeting to determine next steps will be held 24 to 26 June 2024, so in a few weeks' time. Also yesterday, we published a briefing on our recommendations for this process, which I will also share in the chat, and I hope that is helpful. I've seen a very good question on intellectual property in the chat, but I think I'm running out of time to answer it, so either I type an answer or we can cover it in the Q&A. Cheers.
Thank you, Daniel. We can take the question in the Q&A session soon after one more presentation. And thank you for focusing not only on the equity mechanisms, but also on the financing mechanism for the same. So as a last speaker, we have Konstantin Busman, who is a policy officer working in the Marine Nature Conservation Division at the German Federal Ministry for the Environment, Nature Conservation, Nuclear Safety, and Consumer Protection. So Konstantin will be sharing with us an overview of Germany's efforts supporting ratification and early implementation. Over to you, Konstantin.
Thank you very much, and hello, everyone. Also from my side, many thanks for the organization of this interesting webinar, and also for having or for giving me the possibility to present the German perspective. Although it has already been emphasized, I would like to stress once again that the importance of the BBNJ agreement for marine nature conservation can hardly be overestimated. With the successful conclusion of the negotiations, the international community has made a valuable contribution to the protection of biodiversity, benefit sharing, and capacity building for future generations. In view of the importance of the BBNJ agreement for achieving the 30 by 30 conservation target for global marine areas, we should lose no time in ratifying and implementing the agreement. Therefore, Germany strongly supports the goal of reaching the needed 60 ratifications by the next UN Ocean Conference in summer 2025 at the latest, to allow the BBNJ agreement to enter into force. In order to ratify the BBNJ agreement and become a party, Germany needs to adopt an implementation law. This will require the involvement of the German Parliament, for ratification, which is a necessity shared by many other states and is requiring thorough preparation. We also consider it very important to advocate for a swift ratification and implementation of the BBNJ agreement in other forums, whether within the G7 with their latest BBNJ declaration or at UNIA 6 with regard to the UN, to the ocean resolution, which was adopted there. Furthermore, the issue of synergy effect is of a particular importance, especially concerning the BBNJ agreement and the CBD. Hence, it was very important that this topic was also addressed during the recent SABSTA meeting last week in Nairobi. And we really hope that we come to a conclusion there with other CBD parties at COP16 in Colombia later this year. With regard to the preparations for the first conference of the parties to the BBNJ, Germany strongly supports the preparatory commission and looks forward to the 3 days international organizational meeting in June, which was just mentioned by the speaker, by the last speaker. The preparatory commission should develop useful recommendations and help ensure the negotiating time is used effectively. The first COP must take a large number of decisions, for instance, to define the mandate and lay down the modalities for the work of its subsidiary bodies. Marine protected areas are important climate protection instruments, as a healthy ocean absorbs significant amounts of man-made carbon dioxide. Therefore, Germany plans to support partner countries in the Global South through the International Climate Initiative in implementing the BBNJ agreement. Their full participation is crucial for implementing the BBNJ agreement and achieving the 30 by 30 target. As Germany, our efforts will focus in particular on the development of proposals for marine protected areas in the high seas, as well as on possible monitoring schemes and compliance mechanisms. As a review process of the submitted project ideas is currently ongoing, we unfortunately cannot share additional details on this EKIP project at the moment. Another point I would like to highlight is the need for a political alliance aiming at effectively driving forward the early implementation of the agreement, an implementation coalition, if you will. Such a coalition should concentrate on preparing the designation of protected area proposals under the BBNJ agreement. Based on science-based approach, it should support the identification of suitable sites and draw up effective and ambitious management plans. Equally important will be to cooperate politically in the negotiations and create alliances among progressive states from the Global North and the Global South, as well as civil society actors. To conclude, the BBNJ agreement is no doubt a milestone, but there's still a lot of work ahead for the international community to deliver its full potential. Germany is prepared to actively contribute in the further process. I will stop here to give us enough amount of time for the Q&A, and thank you very much again for having me. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Konstantin. Thank you for this, bringing in this national perspective, and we are looking forward to coordinated action from Germany towards a swift ratification of the treaty. So we are done with the speakers for the time being, but we have a couple of questions in our chat box. In the Q&A session, we can take it one by one. So there is a question from Mr. David Friedman about what can the public do to support the ratification of the High Seas Treaty? So probably we have Beck. Beck, would you like to take that question?
Yes, sure. Thanks, Shivaja. And thanks, David, for the question. There are a few things that the public can do. One of the main things that they can do is to support to show their government's support for ratification of the treaty. So in many countries, there are public consultations that the governments do, seeking input from the public and all stakeholders about whether or not they support ratification. So there are often public processes, so you can contribute to those, or you can directly write to your ministers or foreign affairs or environment to support the ratification of the treaty. There's also a number or many NGOs active around the world who, as part of the High Seas Alliance, but also our other colleagues in other NGOs who are working on the treaty. So joining those NGO efforts to support ratification is a great idea. The High Seas Alliance has a website, which we can put in the chat, which has a treaty ratification tracker on it. And there you can see what the status of your country is, and we'll have more ways for the public to engage and communicate messages of support to governments in the coming weeks as well. So I think they're like key basic points. And I would also just say actually one very basic thing, because the High Seas Treaty is not well known in the public. So just even talking to friends and family and networks about why the High Seas Treaty is important, I think is really valuable, because lots of people don't even know what the high seas are. So thanks for the question.
Thank you, Peg. So we have another question from Ayub Omar Dada. So his question is that given the lack of provisions on intellectual property in the draft BBNJ treaty agreement, how do you think parties should approach the issue of access and benefit sharing for marine genetic resources found in areas beyond national jurisdiction? What are the key challenges in developing a framework to balance scientific research, commercial interest, and equitable utilization of these resources? Daniel, would you have some time to respond to this?
Sure. Thank you, Sivaja. So that's a very good question. Actually, looking at some of the earlier drafts of the text before it was adopted, there was a particular paragraph about intellectual property until the very final session. It was taken out during IGC 5.2, just before the text was agreed. So I think, as with many provisions, how they will work in practice and how they will be implemented is something that we will see over time. But just in terms of the basics, it's the state's obligation, to ensure that actors under their jurisdiction comply with the MGR provisions. That obligation is with the state. So states will have to find some way to make sure that they can have enough sort of understanding of what is happening under their jurisdiction to make sure that they can that actors under their jurisdiction comply with the MGR provisions. There's also, on the treaty side, the BBNJ batch identifier, which will be a human and machine readable unique identifier that gets created at the point of the pre-cruise notification, and that is then supposed to follow the marine genetic resources and digital sequence information throughout its sort of chain of custody, and to allow for example, later utilization to be picked up. But how all of that will work exactly in practice is something that states will surely spend a lot of time deliberating and discussing on in the future. And I hope that's a helpful response.
Thank you, Daniel. And we have a couple of more questions coming out. There's a question on the funding. The question is like this. Given SDG 14 is the least funded of all the SDGs and historic lack of political support for funding activities in the global commons, what is the High Seas Alliance and the NGO community doing to mobilize funding that underlies CBTMT, which is an enabler of all other topics? why have there been no specific advocacy of amounts for front-loaded funding of BBNJ implementation? So can Natalie or Beck take the question?
Sorry, Sivaja. This was the question from Fawad.
There's a question from Fawad.
Well, I think that maybe Daniel is a better person to answer that question. I don't know, Daniel, if you're able to answer that question.
I'll give it a shot. Hi, Fuad. Great to see you in the webinar. So, as Fuad rightfully raises, there are a lot of financing needs that already apply. I didn't mention it explicitly, but the financial mechanism of the BBNJ agreement will only enter into force when the agreement enters into force. So only 120 days after 60 states have ratified, which means that any capacity building implementation support that takes place between now and that point in time needs to be funded through other sources. There are already, for example, in our finance briefing, we've provided some examples for funding sources that are already open. So, for example, under the current GEF fund, states can already, following the GEF rules, apply for funding to support their implementation and ratification efforts. There are initiatives like Mr. Wussmann from Germany mentioned that come from the member state side, where civil society or implementing agencies, so non-state actors, can apply for that type of funding. Philanthropy, as a broader group, has leveraged about 10 million so far, and Fuad is most likely going to say that that doesn't reach the amount needed, and I would tend to agree. But sort of in the agreement itself, we have the special fund. We have the finance committee. We have the goals to reach certain fundraising goals. It's really the period prior to the entry into force of the agreement right now, where all of these provisions don't exist yet, and where only other sources are available. And I hope that is a helpful answer.
Thank you, Daniel. And there is a question addressed to Khalil. It's on, will the new BBNJ agreement have an impact on deep sea mining if it goes ahead? There is a related question from Abdullah Kishlaf. The question is like this: how can the BBNJ agreement prevent the battle of seabed mining? Khalil, would you like to take the question?
Thanks, Savia, and thanks for those questions. Really good questions. So the deep sea bed mining regime has a governing body, as many may know, which is the International Seabed Authority. That's a deep seabed mining regime in areas beyond national jurisdiction. During the negotiation of the BBNJ agreement, the question of not undermining was very prominent. So the BBNJ agreement and its environmental impact assessment provisions, with regard to deep seabed mining, there are actually rules and regulations and being developed under the International Seabed Authority. So they are developing their own EIA regime at the moment. They are a bit far. They're more advanced than BBNJ, of course, because BBNJ was just adopted. The ISA has been around for a little while, and they are a bit more advanced in developing their EIA rules. However, under Article 29 of the BBNJ agreement, parties shall promote the use of EIA standards and guidelines developed under the BBNJ agreement in relevant instruments, frameworks and bodies, or IFBs. And this would include the ISA, who has competency over the deep sea bed mining regime. So whatever rules and guidelines are developed under the BBNJ agreement in the future, parties to the BBNJ agreement, who are also parties to the ISA, or the International Seabed Mining Regime, have the obligation to promote those rules in the ISA. And also, in developing these standards and guidelines under the BBNJ agreement, they're supposed to be developed collaboratively with other relevant institutions, frameworks, and bodies. So it is expected that the ISA would be involved in developing of future EIA rules under the BBNJ agreement. I hope that answers the question. Thanks.
Thank you, Khalil. There's a question whether all G20 countries indicated they will ratify the treaty, and how important are these countries in relation to the treaty? Konstantin, could you please take that question?
Yeah, glad to. Thank you very much. Like the G20 last year, they agreed in their declaration on the call for the swift implementation and entry into force of the BBNJ agreement. But it has to be said that for now, not all G20 countries already have signed the agreement, and the ratification process is merely like an internal process. So we also don't know where every country stands on that. As I explained, we in Germany, we are preparing for the ratification, which needs an implementation law. So it's ongoing for all the countries. Concerning the second question, how important are they? From our perspective, since we have the goal of reaching the needed 60 ratifications as soon as possible for the agreement to entry into force, every country counts the same. So as fast as we reach the 60, that doesn't depend on whether one country would be more important or less important. Every ratification counts. And so we are pushing for also in the G7 and also in the G20 that we really have an ambitious goal there, that all our partner countries have an ambition timeline for their own ratification or signing of the BBNJ agreement, so we can reach the threshold of 60 declarations as fast as possible. Thank you.
Thank you, Konstantin. And there is a question from Aline. She's on the agreement ratification by the countries depends directly on legislative government bodies adapting countries' law to match the BBNJ agreement's needs. How do the workshops work on this capacity building previously on the treaty implementation? Can Amber take this question, please?
Thank you very much. So this is a great question, and we are in the position at the division to provide capacity building. We are not in the position to tell states how to domesticate international law into their legal system. So we're in a position where we want to provide a lot of information about the treaty, but these kind of domestic processes is something where we as the Secretariat are not able to get involved. But what we like to do then is to facilitate discussion with other states, and maybe developed states and developing states together, states that are further along the line, they have already ratified, and they can kind of share experiences. And we also have within our budget for promoting a better understanding of the agreement, money for bilateral technical assistance, which would be also to be able to provide states through consultancy, so not directly from the Secretariat, but we can hire consultants to help them to better understand their needs for the domestication process of the BBNJ agreement. Thank you.
Thank you, and thank you, Amber. There's a question on what decision-making frameworks and criteria do you anticipate the BBNJ treaty parties will establish to determine the appropriate division of responsibilities between the new BBNJ mechanisms and the competence of existing regional sectoral management bodies like RFMOs? Daniel, could you please take that question?
Yes, sure. Very similar to what Khalil mentioned just a second ago, this relates very much to the relationship of the BBNJ agreement to existing international frameworks and bodies. As Khalil mentioned, states found this language around not undermine. Leading up to the final text, there were sort of two major parts in that gradient. One was not undermine the competencies of, meaning that if a existing body has a legal mandate about something, BBNJ can't touch it. And the other extreme would be not undermining the effectiveness of, meaning that it's a functional test. Does the other body actually fulfill this topic? Does it deliver on this topic? And only in that case, BBNJ wouldn't be able to touch it. We've come to a point in the middle in the text, not undermine, that I would argue leaves some flexibility of interpretation of how states will actually handle this. It's also complemented by Article 8 that says that states through the BBNJ agreement shall promote the objectives of the BBNJ agreement in decision-making and other bodies. And so I think with many of these relationships, the BBNJ agreement requires, there's a requirement that the BBNJ agreement takes into account these other bodies, and there's consultation. And so there's sort of some kind of consideration or process that will be set up. But where exactly states will land on specifically when can BBNJ take action and when BBNJ can't take action, I think we'll have to see through evolved state practice.
Thank you, Daniel. Thank you so much for the responses. I know that we have a couple of more questions, but because of the time constraints, I'm so sorry to say that we won't be able to take up any further questions, but we still can keep the conversations rolling. Please write to us. We'll be able to answer your questions through further communication as well. And with that, I would like to close the webinar with one last reminder about the policy recommendations that we are developing. We have already typed in the link to the policy brief, which we are developing in consultation with all the participants and the panelists. So please feel free to share your inputs in that. And thank you very much to the speakers for this very interactive panel. And thank you so much to all the participants who were very active and also for asking those brilliant questions. Thank you so much for everyone. With this, I would like to close the session and also thanking the interpreters for their support. Thank you so much. Have a nice day.